Well, hello everybody. I'm actually doing this for the second time because I went over time uh, longer than 10 minutes, and that's what the limitations for YouTube are. So I'm going to see if I can speed things up a little bit more. Otherwise, I'll turn it into two presentations. I just wanted to focus in on a few things for you. First of all, hi, how are you? I hope everything is going well for all of you. I've just reviewed the material for topic 3 and have created some very long, detailed outlines for my notes, my lecture notes. I found that some of the things that Fagan was talking about were a little cluttered, and I'm hoping that in the lectures that I've produced and the lecture outlines that actually I've sort of limited some of this particular clutter. At least that's my hope. So anyway, take a look at those, and I think that things will clear up a little bit for you if you read the lecture notes and the Fagan book hand in hand. I just want to make some observations as I was reviewing that material, and these observations actually take me back to the Coster site. I wanted to talk about that very briefly because you will notice that, especially when we talk about southwestern cultures and the cultures of the eastern woodlands, we do talk about the archaic as being at the root of these particular cultures, that they're not something completely unique, but they have their roots in the archaic. And I wanted to talk about these roots very briefly, or at least some of these roots very briefly. First of all, with respect to the Coster site, not only was it methodologically important, it was also important in terms of what we learned about human behavior. Now, the Coster site was 9,000 years of human behavior, a lot of it associated with hunters and gatherers. And what we learned through time, especially as we proceeded through to the late Archaic, was that hunter and gatherers had the capability of limiting their mobility and becoming fully settled people. Now, that is something that we had assumed only farmers were capable of, this becoming fully settled, because the nature of plant domestication required them to become fully settled, among other reasons. Hunters and gatherers were always visualized as being somewhat at the mercy of nature, constantly moving around. Well, you know what? Nothing could be further from the truth. Many hunters and gatherers around the world, and certainly those that we found in Coster, knew their environment, knew when certain types of foods would become available, knew how to use these different types of foods, scheduled their activities according to a yearly round so that they could take advantage of a series of microenvironments which produced either very specialized types of foods at certain times of the year, or actually had foodstuffs, plants, and animals that cut across a series of microenvironments. So this was planning. This was using a variety of foodstuffs, and cutting across a whole series of microenvironments, looking at reliability, predictability, nearness, abundance of foodstuffs. And when all of these variables came together, hunters and gatherers were not only able to limit their mobility, they were able to settle down, and they were able to develop fairly complex ways of life. They did not need farming for this. Continuing with this idea of hunters and gatherers, as we proceed from the late Archaic into the early woodland, we find that people are still hunter and gatherers. And yes, they are more sedentary in certain parts of the Americas, and yes, they are leading more complex lives, again, in certain parts of the Americas, but we also find that because of their knowledge of the various plants and animals that they have been using, they are beginning to become more involved in the success of some of these plants. For example, some of the plants that we find in the Midwest associated with hopewell culture, plants such as amaranth, they are wild plants. But what we are finding is that people are weeding the wild plant stands They are perhaps aerating the ground around the wild plant stands. In other words, they're taking wild plants and working to ensure their success as plants. And we find in the archaeological record that indeed some of the seeds, they're still wild, but that some of the seeds are becoming larger, which is something that we would find because of cultivation, of this care of wild plants among these hunters and gatherers. We also find that people did not necessarily abandon. I've got my notes over here. That people did not necessarily abandon farming, abandon hunting and gathering overnight for farming. It wasn't a case of, okay, we've got corn, beans, and squash available to us. They're great. They're wonderful sources of protein when you eat them together. We're going to abandon everything now and change our way of life dramatically. In fact, that was not the case. The new domesticates, whatever they may have been, as people are using them, experimenting with them, taking advantage of perhaps mutations of some of these wild plants, that these plant systems of potential domesticates have to compete for the attention of the hunter and gatherers for other food procurement systems. And I think that's very important, that it is a subtle process, a process which involved changing attention from one particular type of food to another type of food. And in fact, when you look at the archaeological record produced by McNeish, and certainly by McNeish, as you look at some of the many rock shelters, starting with Kashgadlan, you're going to see this pattern show up very quickly, that it is not an all or nothing thing from the beginning, but it is a gradual process. So please pay attention to that, because I think it's particularly important. Regarding trade, I wanted to make some notes about trade, because trade is very prominent in our discussions, both in the Southwest and in the Eastern Woodlands. I'm thinking about the Eastern Woodlands right now. You're going to learn about the Hopewell interaction sphere, whether they call it that or not, but the Hopewell trade system and the importance of trade in Mississippian times. Think about this, though. Imagine now you're in Cahokia, East St. Louis, what is now East St. Louis, Illinois, and you find in a grave mica from the Carolinas, copper from the Great Lake Superior region, rare shells from the Gulf of Mexico, obsidian from or volcanic glass from a particular obsidian flow in Yellowstone National Park. How did they get to East St. Louis, Illinois? And for that, I think we need to remember that the wonderful waterways that we have available in the Americas, whether they're coastal waterways or whether they're the river systems, enable people to move products, whether they're finished goods, whether they're raw materials, whether it's themselves, up and down these water systems. So water systems don't just provide food or water, they are also transportation arteries, which are very important when it comes to trade, when it comes to connections between peoples of various cultures. So as you read about these different cultures, whether you're reading about Chaco Canyon, which seems like it's in the middle of nowhere if you visited today, but it was certainly in the middle of, very much in the middle of somewhere, with trade connections as far as Mexico and other places. These people were connected. They were not isolated for the most part. It's always such a surprise, I think, in the archaeological record when we find these connections, and yet we know that this is something that people were aware of and they took advantage of as well. So I'm going to stop right now, and hopefully I've made it just long enough. So take care, everybody, and I look forward to talking to you soon. Bye-bye.